A life in the balance. Dr. William Carter sat behind his large mahogany desk in his spacious office at Evergreen Medical Center, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. The walls around him were adorned with certificates, diplomas, and awards from decades of medical service. Yet today, the titles and accolades felt hollow. The prestigious surgeon, known for his steady hands and sharp mind, was beginning to feel the toll of years spent in sterile operating rooms, saving lives while his own drifted by. He had just completed his third surgery of the day, a complex and exhausting procedure to remove a tumor from a middle-aged woman's lungs. It was the kind of life and death work that required precision, skill, and focus. But lately, William had felt a gnawing emptiness, one that whispered questions he couldn't silence. When had he last connected with a patient on more than just a clinical level? When had he truly made a difference beyond the mechanical task of surgery? The soft knock on his door interrupted his brooding thoughts. He looked up to see Beth, his longtime assistant, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Her warm smile, tinged with concern, reminded him why she had been with him for so long. "Dr. Carter," she began, stepping into the room. "There's someone here to see you. It's urgent." William raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Send them in." Beth opened the door wider, and a woman entered, her appearance in stark contrast to the sterile professional environment of the hospital. She wore a frayed jacket over a simple dress, her hands gripping a small purse as though it contained everything she had left in the world. Her eyes were red and swollen, evidence of sleepless nights and constant tears. "Dr. Carter," she said softly, her voice trembling with desperation. "Please, I'm begging you. My son, he's dying." William's heart gave a slight lurch as the woman's words washed over him. He'd heard many stories like this over the years, but something about her tone, about the deep well of pain in her eyes, drew him in. "Please, sit down," William said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. He leaned forward, his gaze softening as he assessed her. "What's your son's condition?" The woman sat, her fingers trembling as she opened her purse and pulled out a crumpled stack of papers. She placed them on the desk, her hand brushing the medical documents as though afraid they might crumble. "His name is Marcus. He's 12 years old," she began, her voice breaking. "He was diagnosed with a severe heart defect when he was born. We've been in and out of hospitals, and now they say without surgery, he won't make it." William nodded, listening carefully. "And the surgery, why hasn't it been done yet?" Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she spoke. "We don't have the money. No insurance, no resources. Every hospital has turned us away. They won't even look at him without a payment plan. And I can barely keep a roof over our heads. Please, Dr. Carter, I'm not asking for charity, just for a chance to save my son." William's heart tightened. He'd seen cases like this before, families torn apart by financial strain, denied life-saving treatment because they couldn't afford it. But something about this woman's plea struck him deeply. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the despair in her eyes, and it stirred something inside him. "What's his condition now?" William asked, keeping his tone steady. "He's getting worse," she replied, her hand shaking as she fumbled for the papers. "He can barely breathe some days. He's so weak, he can't even walk up the stairs to his bedroom anymore. I'm terrified. I don't want to lose him." William felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen so many patients over the years, but the thought of a boy, barely 12, facing death because of something beyond his control, a condition he had been born with, made his stomach turn. "Bring Marcus in tomorrow," William said, surprising even himself with the swiftness of his decision. "I'll examine him, and we'll take it from there. We'll figure something out." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. But I don't have any money." William gave her a reassuring smile. "Let's focus on getting him well first. We'll worry about the rest later." She stood, her hands still trembling as she clutched her purse to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you enough." As she left the room, William sat back in his chair, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. He hadn't planned on getting involved in another charity case. He barely had time to breathe between surgeries. But something about that woman's plea had touched him in a way he hadn't felt in years. As the day went on, William found himself thinking about Marcus more and more. There was a fire in the boy's mother, a determination that reminded him of the reasons he had become a doctor in the first place. She wasn't just asking for help. She was fighting for her son's life with everything she had. William couldn't ignore that. He wouldn't. Later that evening, as he walked through the hospital's empty parking lot, the cool night air cleared his mind. He thought of his own family, his own daughter, and the quiet distance that had grown between them over the years. He had missed her ballet recitals, her school plays, and too many family dinners to count, all because he was caught up in the world of medicine. But here was a chance to make a difference, not just medically, but personally, to give back in a way that mattered, not just for Marcus, but for himself. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Beth, telling her to clear his schedule for the next morning. He had a patient to see, one who needed him more than any of the others. Little did Dr. William Carter know that saving Marcus would set into motion a series of events that would change his life forever. As he drove home that night, the stars above seemed a little brighter, the air a little crisper. A quiet resolve settled over him. Tomorrow, he would meet the boy whose life hung in the balance, and perhaps in saving him, William would find a new path for his own. The diagnosis and the decision. The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon as Dr. William Carter stood at the hospital entrance, his breath visible in the crisp air. It was earlier than usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling of urgency pulling him out of bed and into the sterile halls of Evergreen Medical Center. Today was different. Today wasn't about another scheduled surgery or a well-to-do patient with a minor ailment. Today was about Marcus. As he entered the hospital, the familiar hum of machines, the shuffle of nurses, and the soft murmurs of early morning rounds greeted him like an old friend. But his mind wasn't focused on the routine. He was already thinking about the boy and his mother. Sandra, was it? Yes, Sandra. Her face had haunted him all night, the raw fear in her eyes when she talked about her son, and the weight of desperation in her voice. He could still feel it, the way her words clung to the edges of his thoughts. Dr. Carter, Beth's voice pulled him from his reverie. She was standing behind the reception desk, her ever-present clipboard in hand. Your special patient is here. William nodded. Thank you, Beth. Show them to my office. He walked with purpose, his white coat billowing slightly as he passed rows of examination rooms. There was a certain energy in the air, the kind that came before something monumental, and he couldn't shake the feeling that today would mark the beginning of something much larger than himself. When William entered his office, Sandra was already seated, holding Marcus's hand tightly in hers. The boy looked frail, too frail for a child his age. His skin was pale, his cheeks hollowed, and his dark eyes, though lively, were sunken into his thin face. Despite his weakened state, Marcus tried to smile at William, but it was a smile lined with exhaustion. Hello, Marcus, William said, crouching down to the boy's level, his voice warm and reassuring. I'm Dr. Carter, and I'm going to take care of you, okay? Marcus nodded, his eyes lighting up just a little at the doctor's kind tone. Sandra, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand tighter. William could see the fear etched in every line of her face, but also the faintest glimmer of hope. Thank you, Dr. Carter, she whispered, her voice hoarse from nights of crying and worry. Thank you for seeing us. William smiled softly. Let's see how we can help Marcus. We'll start with a few tests to get a better understanding of what's going on with his heart, and we'll take it from there. Over the next few hours, Marcus underwent a battery of tests. William had instructed his team to handle the boy with the utmost care, ensuring every technician, nurse, and aide knew the gravity of the situation. Marcus, though visibly fatigued, endured the process with remarkable patience. He was young, but his spirit shone through in the way he asked questions, The way he smiled at the nurses, and the way he kept squeezing his mother's hand, as if assuring her that everything would be fine. By early afternoon, William had gathered all the test results. He sat in his office, reviewing them one by one, his brow furrowing as he delved deeper into the complexity of Marcus's condition. The hole in Marcus's heart, an atrial septal defect, was far larger than anticipated. And to make matters worse, there were complications involving the surrounding tissue, a malformation that would make surgery difficult, if not dangerous. Time was running out, and the longer they waited, the slimmer Marcus's chances of survival would become. William sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his temples. This was no ordinary case. He had seen many patients with heart defects over the years, but Marcus's situation was critical. The boy didn't just need surgery. He needed it soon, and it had to be done with absolute precision. But the biggest hurdle wasn't the complexity of the surgery itself. It was the financial situation. Sandra had made it clear. They had no insurance, no savings, no way to pay for the life-saving procedure. And while William had performed pro bono surgeries in the past, this would be different. The surgery would be extensive, requiring specialized equipment, an elite surgical team, and a prolonged hospital stay. The costs would be astronomical. A soft knock at the door brought William back to the present. "Come in," he called out, knowing who it would be. Sandra stepped in hesitantly, her eyes wide with anxiety, her hands wringing the strap of her worn purse. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. How is Marcus? What did you find?" William gestured for her to sit, taking a deep breath before responding. "Sandra, Marcus's condition is more serious than I initially thought. He has a significant heart defect, and without surgery, his heart will continue to weaken." Sandra's face paled, and her breath hitched. How long does he have?" "It's hard to say," William said softly, "but we need to act soon. The longer we wait, the greater the risk of heart failure." Tears welled in Sandra's eyes, but she held them back, her voice trembling as she asked, "What about the surgery? How much? How much will it cost?" William hesitated, knowing this was the moment that would crush her. "The surgery is complicated, and the hospital stay will be long. Altogether, the cost will likely exceed $100,000. Sandra gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "100? I can't possibly." "I know," William said quickly, his voice gentle but firm. "And that's why I'm not going to let you worry about the money." Sandra blinked, confused. What do you mean?" "I'm going to perform the surgery, Sandra. For free. No costs, no bills. I'll take care of everything," William said, his words steady and calm, as though he had made this decision 100 times before. Sandra stared at him in shock, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. But how? Why would you?" "Because Marcus deserves a chance," William said simply. "And so do you. I've seen too many families torn apart because of medical costs, and I won't let that happen here. I'll take care of it." The tears finally spilled over, rolling down Sandra's cheeks as she sobbed quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. "I don't know how to thank you." William smiled gently, reaching out to take her hand. "You don't have to thank me. Let's just focus on getting Marcus healthy." The decision was made. William would perform the surgery, and he would do everything in his power to save Marcus's life. But as he watched Sandra cry tears of relief, he knew this wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback from the hospital administration, questions from his colleagues, and the ever-present shadow of doubt about the risks involved. But none of that mattered now. Marcus had become more than just a patient. He had become a symbol of everything William had once loved about medicine. A chance to make a difference, to heal, to bring hope where there was none. As Sandra left his office, William sat back in his chair, the weight of the upcoming surgery already settling on his shoulders. He would need to prepare, mentally, physically, and emotionally. This surgery would be one of the hardest of his career, but it was also one of the most important. Tomorrow, Marcus would be admitted for pre-surgical preparation, and William would step into the operating room with a clear mission: save the boy's life, no matter the cost. As he stared out the window, watching the fading sunlight paint the hospital in hues of orange and gold, William felt a quiet resolve. This was why he had become a doctor. This was what it meant to heal, not just with scalpels and sutures, but with compassion and humanity. Tomorrow, Marcus's life would hang in the balance, and William would do everything in his power to make sure that balance tipped in the boy's favor. The pressure and the preparation. The following day dawned with a sense of urgency and anticipation that William had not felt in years. As the sun rose, casting its warm glow over the hospital, William Carter prepared himself for what would be the most critical surgery of his career. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his modest apartment, his eyes scanning the reflection that stared back at him. His face looked more tired than usual, the lines of age and experience etched into his skin. He ran a hand through his graying hair and let out a deep breath. This was not just any surgery. This was Marcus, the boy who, in a short amount of time, had become the symbol of everything William had once stood for, the embodiment of a life worth saving, regardless of the obstacles. The hospital halls buzzed with their usual early morning energy, but to William, it all felt distant, like background noise. Today, nothing else mattered. Every step he took toward the pre-op ward felt heavier than the last, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him with each passing second. Yet, amidst the pressure, there was also a quiet determination. He would not fail Marcus. As he reached the nurse's station, he spotted Sandra sitting in a chair near Marcus's room. She was nervously twisting a tissue between her fingers, her eyes fixed on the door, as if waiting for news that might save her world. The sight of her stirred something deep within William, a reminder of what was at stake. She had placed all her hopes, all her trust, in him. "Dr. Carter," Sandra said, standing as soon as she saw him. Her voice was weak, worn out from worry and sleepless nights, but she forced a small smile for his benefit. How is everything going?" William smiled back, his calm and collected demeanor offering the only solace he could give in that moment. "Everything is on track. Marcus is in good hands and will be starting shortly." Sandra nodded, but her smile faltered as she bit her lower lip. I just wanted to say thank you again. I don't know how to repay you, Dr. Carter. I don't know if I ever can." William placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to worry about that. The only thing you need to focus on is being there for Marcus. That's what's most important right now." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He's so brave, you know. More than I ever thought he could be. But he's still scared. And I'm scared too." "I'd be worried if you weren't," William said gently. "But I promise you, Sandra, I'll do everything in my power to make sure he comes out of this stronger than ever." With that, William turned and walked toward the operating theater. He could feel Sandra's hopeful gaze on his back as he disappeared through the doors, stepping into the sterilized, pristine environment of the surgical suite. Inside, the operating room was a flurry of activity. The surgical team was busy prepping, sterilizing instruments, setting up monitors, and ensuring everything was in place for the delicate procedure that lay ahead. The smell of disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a familiar scent that usually calmed William. Today, it only reminded him of how much was at stake. "Everything ready, Dr. Carter?" asked Linda, his surgical nurse, as she adjusted her mask and handed him the necessary reports. Her voice carried the weight of years of working alongside him, of knowing when something extraordinary was about to happen. "Yes," William replied, his tone steady. "We've got a complicated surgery ahead, but we're ready." Linda gave him a knowing nod, and together, they reviewed Marcus's medical data one last time. The images from the echocardiograms, the charts showing the progression of his heart defect. It all painted a bleak picture. The atrial septal defect was larger than they had hoped, and the surrounding tissues were weakened, making the repair difficult. It was a delicate dance of precision and time, and any wrong move could lead to disaster. But this was what William excelled at. He had faced seemingly impossible odds before, and today would be no different. He was about to fight for Marcus's life with every ounce of skill and expertise he had. As they wheeled Marcus into the operating room, the boy's small body looked even more fragile under the stark fluorescent lights. He was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were wide open, taking in everything around him. He clutched a small, worn-out teddy bear in his hands, one William hadn't noticed before. "Hey, Marcus," William said as he crouched down beside the gurney. "How are you feeling today, buddy?" Marcus tried to smile, but it was strained. "I'm scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible. William nodded, his eyes softening. "That's okay. It's normal to be scared. But you know what? You're in great hands. My team and I are going to take really good care of you, and before you know it, you'll be back home with your mom." Marcus nodded, gripping his teddy bear tighter. "Promise." "I promise," William said firmly, holding out his pinky finger. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then hooked his own small pinky around William's. It was a child's gesture, but in that moment, it carried the weight of the world. As the anesthesia took hold, and Marcus's eyes fluttered closed, William stood and took a deep breath. The time had come. The room grew quiet as the surgical team assembled around the table, their faces masked but their eyes focused with intense concentration. "Let's begin," William said, his voice cutting through the silence. His hands moved swiftly, expertly, as the surgery began. Hours passed in a blur of precision and concentration. The hole in Marcus's heart was larger than anticipated, the tissue around it weak and fragile. Each stitch had to be perfect, each movement calculated with the utmost care. The monitors beeped steadily, a constant reminder of Marcus's precarious condition. Sweat dripped from William's brow, but he paid it no mind. He was lost in the work, his entire being focused on one thing: saving this boy's life. The weight of every suture, every incision, pressed down on him like a physical force, but he pushed through, determined to succeed. As the surgery progressed, there were moments of tension. The fragile tissue around Marcus's heart tore at one point, sending a wave of panic through the room. But William remained calm, his hand steady as he worked quickly to repair the damage. The hours stretched on, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, William made the final stitch. He stepped back, his chest rising and falling with deep, exhausted breaths. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He made it. The team around him sighed with relief, and Linda smiled behind her mask. "You did it, Dr. Carter." William nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Marcus's still form. His chest rose and fell steadily, his heart now beating with the strength it had been denied for so long. The surgery was a success, but it had taken everything William had. As Marcus was wheeled into recovery, William finally allowed himself to breathe. His body ached with exhaustion, his mind buzzing from the intensity of the surgery, but there was a quiet satisfaction blooming in his chest. He had done it. He had kept his promise. In the recovery room, Sandra sat beside Marcus, her eyes filled with tears as she watched her son breathe peacefully for the first time in months. She looked up as William entered, her expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. How is he?" she whispered. "He's going to be fine," William said, smiling warmly. The surgery was a success. Sandra let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hands as tears streamed down her face. She stood and threw her arms around William, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. I don't know how to ever repay you." William returned the hug, feeling a lump form in his throat. "You don't have to repay me," he said quietly. "Just take care of Marcus. That's all I ask." As he stepped out of the room, Leaving Sandra and Marcus to their moment of peace, William felt a profound sense of accomplishment. But it wasn't just about the surgery. It was about something more. It was about reconnecting with the reasons he had become a doctor in the first place. It was about finding the humanity in medicine again. But as the adrenaline of the surgery began to fade, William knew the journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead: recovery, rehabilitation, and the inevitable questions from the hospital administration. And while Marcus's life had been saved, William couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something even greater than he had anticipated. Little did he know, the true impact of his actions was yet to unfold. Aftermath and unforeseen consequences. The days following Marcus's surgery were a whirlwind of activity, emotion, and recovery. Dr. William Carter, though physically exhausted, found himself visiting Marcus every day, even when his own duties pulled him in other directions. The boy had come through the surgery remarkably well, but the road to full recovery would be long and fraught with uncertainty. On the third morning after the surgery, William found himself standing outside Marcus's recovery room, watching the boy through the small window in the door. Sandra sat by his bedside, holding his hand, her fingers constantly brushing through his hair, as if making sure he was still there. The monitors beeped rhythmically, signaling steady progress. Marcus was awake now, his skin showing signs of returning color, though he still looked weak and fragile. William entered the room quietly, not wanting to disturb the peace that had settled over the two. Sandra looked up, her tired eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Dr. Carter," she said softly, standing to greet him. "You saved him." William smiled, his heart lifting at her words. "Marcus is a fighter. He did a lot of the work himself." Sandra shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "No, it's you. You gave him another chance at life. I can never thank you enough." Marcus stirred, his eyelids fluttering open as he turned to face William. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Hi, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice weak but filled with gratitude. "Hi, buddy," William said, stepping closer to the bed. "How are you feeling today?" Marcus shifted slightly, wincing from the soreness that still plagued him after the invasive surgery. "Better. Tired, but better." "That's good to hear," William said, pulling up a chair next to the bed. "You've been through a lot, but you're making great progress. Just keep resting, and before you know it, you'll be back on your feet." Marcus's face brightened, though his energy was still low. "Mom says I'm going to be just fine." "That's right," William agreed. "You're going to be better than fine." Sandra smiled down at her son, her expression a mixture of pride and overwhelming relief. But as William watched them, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him that there were still hurdles to overcome. Hurdles that no amount of medical expertise could fix. As if on cue, Beth appeared in the doorway, her usual calm demeanor tinged with urgency. She caught William's eye and gestured for him to step outside. With a quick smile at Marcus and Sandra, William excused himself and joined Beth in the hallway. "What is it?" William asked, his voice low as he closed the door behind him. Beth glanced around, making sure no one else was within earshot. "Dr. Carter, you should know, the hospital administration has been asking questions about the surgery." William's stomach tightened. He had expected this. Performing a complex surgery pro bono on a patient without insurance was bound to raise some eyebrows, but he had hoped it would take longer for the higher-ups to catch wind of it. "What kind of questions?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "They want to know why you took on such a risky case, especially without securing payment or insurance first. The CFO's office is concerned about the financial implications. They're saying it sets a bad precedent." William clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had anticipated pushback, but it still stung to hear that the hospital, an institution dedicated to saving lives, was more concerned with money than with the well-being of a child. "Beth, they can't possibly expect me to stand by and watch a child die because of money," he said, his voice laced with irritation. Marcus needed surgery. There wasn't time to wait for insurance approval or payment plans. "I know," Beth said quickly. "And you did the right thing. Everyone on the medical staff knows that. But the administration doesn't always see things the same way. They're talking about meeting with you to discuss protocol." William sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had always hated the politics of medicine. The bureaucracy, the red tape, the way finances seemed to take precedence over patients' lives. But this was the reality he had to face. "When's the meeting?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Beth replied. 9 a.m. sharp. They're expecting you in the boardroom." William nodded. "Thanks, Beth. I'll be there." As she walked away, William felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He leaned against the wall, his mind racing. How had it come to this? He had spent years building his reputation as a surgeon, saving lives, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the operating room. And now, because he had chosen to save a boy's life without first securing a payment method, he was facing scrutiny. That evening, after a long day of rounds and consultations, William sat in his office, staring at the empty walls. He thought of Marcus, lying in his hospital bed, and of Sandra's tearful gratitude. He thought of all the patients he had helped over the years, the lives he had saved, and the families who had been able to walk out of the hospital with their loved ones. But the weight of the hospital's financial concerns hung over him like a dark cloud. He knew that saving Marcus was the right thing to do. There was no question in his mind about that. But in the cold, sterile world of hospital administration, right and wrong often took a backseat to balance sheets and profit margins. The next morning, William walked into the boardroom, his back straight and his jaw set. The room was filled with members of the hospital's executive team, men and women in suits who had never set foot in an operating room, yet held the power to determine the course of his career. "Dr. Carter," began Mr. Daniels, the CFO, a tall, thin man with a stern expression and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. "Thank you for joining us." William nodded but remained silent, waiting for the inevitable reprimand. "We've been reviewing the case of Marcus Thompson," Mr. Daniels continued, his tone measured and precise. "And while we understand that you acted out of compassion, we have concerns about the financial implications of performing such a complex surgery without securing any form of payment." William bristled at the cold detachment in Mr. Daniels' voice, but he kept his tone calm. Marcus's condition was critical. He would not have survived without immediate intervention. There was no time to go through the usual channels. "We understand that," another board member interjected, a woman named Ms. Avery, her voice soft but firm. "But we also have to consider the precedent this sets. If we allow patients to receive high-cost surgeries without payment, we risk opening the floodgates for similar cases. The hospital has to remain financially viable in order to continue providing care." William fought the urge to roll his eyes. "So what you're saying is that saving a child's life is only worthwhile if it doesn't cost the hospital too much money?" Mr. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Ms. Avery remained composed. "That's not what we're saying, Dr. Carter. We're simply asking that, in the future, you adhere to the hospital's protocols. Financial approval must be obtained before any major surgery is performed." "And what happens when there's no time for financial approval?" William asked, his voice rising slightly. "What happens when a patient walks through those doors, and they're minutes away from death? Do we let them die because they can't afford the procedure?" The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Finally, Mr. Daniels spoke again, his tone clipped. "Dr. Carter, we're not here to debate philosophy. We're here to ensure the hospital continues to function as both a medical institution and a business. Your actions, while well-intentioned, have put us in a difficult position." William stared at them, incredulous. "So what are you saying? That I should have let Marcus die?" Mr. Daniels sighed. "We're not saying that at all. But going forward, we need you to follow protocol. We can't have doctors making financial decisions on their own. There's a system in place for a reason." William shook his head, his frustration mounting. He had expected resistance, but this level of cold bureaucracy was more than he could stomach. "I didn't make a financial decision," William said, his voice steely. "I made a medical decision, and I'd do it again." The board members exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by his defiance. But before they could respond, William stood up. "If you're looking for someone who's going to prioritize profit over patients, then maybe you've got the wrong surgeon," he said, his voice low but firm. "But as long as I'm here, I'm going to keep saving lives, whether they can pay or not." With that, he turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the stunned executives in his wake. The hospital was bustling with activity as William made his way back to Marcus's room. He felt a surge of renewed purpose as he walked through the corridors. He had fought for Marcus's life, and he wasn't about to let a group of number crunchers make him feel guilty for it. As he entered the recovery room, Marcus was sitting up in bed, a little more color in his cheeks. Sandra looked up, her eyes brightening when she saw William. "Dr. Carter," she said, standing up quickly. "Is everything okay?" William smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Everything's just fine, Sandra." He turned to Marcus, who was busy fiddling with his IV line. "How are you feeling, champ?" Marcus grinned, a faint hint of his old energy returning. "I feel a lot better, Dr. Carter. Thanks to you." William sat beside him, his heart swelling with pride. "You're the real hero here, Marcus. You're tougher than most adults I know." Marcus beamed, his small body still fragile but his spirit stronger than ever. As William looked at the boy, he knew that no matter what the hospital administration said, he had made the right decision. Saving Marcus wasn't just about one life. It was about standing up for what was right, for what medicine should be. And in that moment, William realized that this wasn't the end of his fight. It was only the beginning. The ripple effect, and a new beginning. The days following William Carter's confrontation with the hospital administration were filled with a strange mix of tension and relief. On the one hand, the weight of bureaucracy and financial concerns hung heavy over his head, but on the other, Marcus's steady recovery filled him with a profound sense of accomplishment. He had done what he had sworn to do, save a life, regardless of the obstacles. But the battle was far from over. News of Marcus's surgery and William's decision to perform it without payment approval began to spread through the hospital. What had once been a quiet act of compassion was now the subject of whispered conversations in hallways and break rooms. Nurses, doctors, and even patients had heard about the case, and opinions were divided. Some praised William for his courage, calling him a hero who had prioritized human life over money. Others were more pragmatic, warning that such actions could lead to financial chaos if every patient demanded free care. And then there were the administrators, who remained unyielding in their stance. Protocol must be followed. But amid the hospital's growing debate, something unexpected happened. Marcus's story began to reach beyond the walls of Evergreen Medical Center. It started with a simple post on social media. Sandra, overwhelmed with gratitude and emotion, had shared a heartfelt message on her personal account, thanking Dr. William Carter for saving her son's life. She wrote about the financial struggles that had nearly cost Marcus his chance at survival, and how Dr. Carter had stepped in when no one else would. Her words were raw, honest, and filled with the kind of emotion that resonated with everyone who read it. "I will never forget the day a stranger gave me back my son," Sandra had written. "Dr. Carter didn't just save Marcus's life. He saved mine too. He restored my faith in humanity. In a world where everything has a price, he reminded me that some things, like kindness and compassion, are priceless." The post went viral almost overnight. Hundreds of people shared it, and soon it had been picked up by local news outlets. Within days, national media had taken notice. Marcus's story was now out in the world, and Dr. William Carter, a man who had spent decades quietly saving lives, found himself in the spotlight. One morning, as William arrived at the hospital, he was greeted not by the usual hum of nurses and staff, but by a throng of reporters gathered outside the main entrance. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and voices called out to him as he stepped out of his car. "Dr. Carter, is it true you performed a life-saving surgery without payment? Why did you break hospital protocol for Marcus Thompson? Do you think all hospitals should offer free care for patients in need?" William paused, momentarily stunned by the sheer volume of attention. He had never been one for the limelight, preferring the quiet, controlled environment of the operating room to the chaos of public scrutiny. But now, here he was, at the center of a debate that had far-reaching implications. Beth, ever the reliable assistant, appeared at his side, helping to navigate him through the crowd. "This is getting bigger than any of us expected," she whispered as they pushed their way into the hospital. "No kidding," William muttered, still processing the sudden media storm. As they entered the hospital lobby, Beth handed him a stack of messages and news clippings. "There are requests for interviews," she said, glancing at him. "Everyone wants to talk to you. News channels, talk shows, even a few medical journals. It's crazy." William sighed, flipping through the pile of messages. He had never sought fame or recognition. He had only wanted to save Marcus's life. But now, it seemed, his decision had struck a nerve with people across the country. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this," he said quietly, handing the papers back to Beth. "I'm just a surgeon." Beth smiled, her eyes soft with admiration. "You're more than that now. People see you as a hero, Dr. Carter. And whether you like it or not, this story has touched a lot of lives." William nodded, still unsure of how to feel about the situation. But deep down, he knew that the attention wasn't really about him. It was about the bigger issue at hand: the healthcare system, the cost of care, the people who fell through the cracks because they couldn't afford the treatment they needed. It was a conversation that had been brewing for years, and now, because of Marcus, it was coming to a head. William nodded, still unsure of how to feel about the situation. But deep down, he knew that the attention wasn't really about him. It was about the bigger issue at hand: the healthcare system, the cost of care, the people who fell through the cracks because they couldn't afford the treatment they needed. It was a conversation that had been brewing for years, and now, because of Marcus, it was coming to a head. As William made his way to his office, he found himself thinking not just about Marcus, but about all the patients he had seen over the years, the ones who had struggled to pay their bills, the ones who had gone without necessary treatment because they couldn't afford it. He had always done what he could to help, but there were limits to what even he could do within the constraints of the system. But maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to change things. Later that day, William was called into another meeting with the hospital administration. This time, the tone was different. The media attention had shifted the conversation, and now the executives were scrambling to manage the situation. "Dr. Carter," Mr. Daniels began, his usual stern expression now tinged with unease, "we need to talk about the Marcus Thompson case." William crossed his arms, bracing himself for another round of reprimands. "As you know, the story has gained significant media attention," Mr. Daniels continued. "The hospital is being portrayed in a less than favorable light. There are questions about why we would prioritize finances over patient care, and frankly, it's becoming a public relations issue." William suppressed a bitter smile. It always came back to PR with these people. Ms. Avery, the other board member from the previous meeting, chimed in. "Dr. Carter, we're not here to criticize your actions. In fact, given the current situation, we've been rethinking our approach. The public sees you as a hero, and the hospital needs to respond in a way that aligns with that narrative." William raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this was going. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "We're considering setting up a fund," Mr. Daniels explained, leaning forward. "A charitable fund specifically for cases like Marcus, patients who need urgent care but can't afford it. The hospital would cover the costs through donations and grants." William stared at them, his mind racing. It wasn't the systemic change he had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. And how would this fund work? We would establish criteria for eligibility, Ms. Avery said. Patients would apply for assistance, and the fund would cover the costs of life-saving surgeries or treatments that they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. Of course, we would still need to maintain oversight to ensure the fund isn't abused. William nodded slowly. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. If the hospital could set up a fund like this, it might help prevent another family from going through what Sandra had faced. All right, William said, his voice measured. But I want to be involved. I want to help set the criteria. And I want to make sure the people who need it most get the care they deserve. The executives exchanged glances, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Mr. Daniels nodded. We can work with that. After the meeting, William returned to his office, feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration. He had made progress, but there was still so much more to do. The healthcare system was deeply flawed, and one charitable fund wouldn't fix it overnight. But at least now, families like Sandra and Marcus wouldn't have to live in fear of losing their loved ones because they couldn't afford treatment. A few days later, Marcus was discharged from the hospital, and William stood at the entrance, watching as Sandra helped her son into the car. Marcus waved at William, his face full of life and energy that hadn't been there before. "Thank you, Dr. Carter." Marcus called out, his voice strong and clear. "I'm going to be a doctor, just like you." William smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You'll be a great one, Marcus. I have no doubt." As the car pulled away, William stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The surgery, the media storm, the confrontation with the administration. It had all been a whirlwind, but in the end, it had been worth it. That night, as William sat in his quiet apartment, the weight of the past few weeks finally began to lift. He had fought for Marcus, and in doing so, he had sparked a conversation that was bigger than himself. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. And as he sat there, a new idea began to form in his mind. An idea that went beyond a charitable fund, beyond the confines of Evergreen Medical Center. Perhaps there was a way to create real, lasting change. Perhaps it was time for him to step out of the operating room and into the world of advocacy, to use his voice and his platform to fight for a healthcare system that truly cared for everyone, regardless of their financial situation. As the night deepened, William Carter realized that his journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. A new mission and the unexpected gratitude. Weeks passed, and Marcus's story continued to ripple far beyond the walls of Evergreen Medical Center. For the first time in years, Dr. William Carter found himself in unfamiliar territory, a place where his name was not just associated with surgical success, but with something deeper: compassion, integrity, and a desire to challenge a broken system. National news outlets picked up the story. Discussions about healthcare costs, patient access, and the role of doctors in advocating for their patients became hot topics across social media platforms, talk shows, and editorials. People began to share their own experiences, stories of loved ones denied care, of financial ruin caused by medical bills, of the anguish that so many families faced when a loved one needed life-saving treatment but couldn't afford it. One evening, as William sat in his living room, the soft glow of the television illuminated the news anchor's face. They were covering Marcus's story yet again, this time with Sandra and Marcus on screen, speaking about their experience. "Dr. Carter didn't just save my life," Marcus said, his voice strong but emotional. "He gave me a future. I wouldn't be here without him. And one day, I'm going to be just like him. I'm going to save people too." Sandra, seated beside her son, smiled softly, her hand resting on his. "There are no words for what Dr. Carter did for us. He didn't just perform surgery. He showed us that there are still people in the world who care more about life than money. If it wasn't for him, I don't know what I'd do. I don't know what any mother would do in my position." William watched in silence, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't the praise that moved him, but the realization that he had touched lives in ways he never anticipated. Saving Marcus had been about more than just a single surgery. It had sparked something larger, a movement, a conversation that was long overdue. But there was more to come. A few days later, as William prepared for another day at the hospital, Beth knocked on his office door, her face bright with excitement. "Dr. Carter, you have a visitor. Someone very special," she said, her smile widening. William raised an eyebrow. Visitors weren't uncommon since the media storm, but Beth's expression suggested this was different. "Who is it?" Beth grinned, stepping aside to reveal an older man, his silver hair neatly combed and his blue eyes sharp with intelligence and warmth. He wore a casual jacket, but it was clear from his posture and demeanor that he was someone important. "Dr. James Marshall," Beth said, the pride evident in her voice, "the former director of the National Healthcare Coalition." William stood abruptly, recognizing the name instantly. Dr. James Marshall had been a pioneer in healthcare reform, a passionate advocate for affordable medical care, and a respected voice in the field. He had led numerous campaigns to push for universal health care and had testified before Congress multiple times. He was, in many ways, a living legend. "Dr. Marshall," William said, extending his hand. "It's an honor." Dr. Marshall shook William's hand firmly, his eyes twinkling with kindness. "The honor is mine, Dr. Carter. I've been following your story, and I have to say, you've done something remarkable. You've sparked a conversation that we've needed for years." William blinked, taken aback by the compliment. I didn't set out to start anything. I just did what I thought was right. And that's precisely why it matters," Dr. Marshall replied, his voice filled with admiration. "In a system that often values profit over people, you took a stand for humanity. You didn't let bureaucracy dictate your decisions, and because of that, you've reminded us all what it truly means to be a doctor." William gestured for Dr. Marshall to sit, still trying to process what was happening. As they settled into chairs, Dr. Marshall leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving William's. "I'm here because I believe you have the potential to do more than just perform surgeries," Dr. Marshall said. "Your story, your actions, they've resonated with people across the country. And that's a rare thing. You have a voice now, Dr. Carter, and I think you can use it to make real, lasting change." William frowned slightly, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" Dr. Marshall smiled knowingly. "I've been working on a new initiative, one that aims to create a network of hospitals and clinics that provide affordable, accessible health care to all, regardless of financial status. It's something I've been planning for years, but we need people like you to lead the charge. Doctors who are willing to stand up, not just in the operating room, but on a national stage. People trust you, Dr. Carter, and if we're going to change the system, we need leaders like you." William sat back, the enormity of the proposal sinking in. He had always been a surgeon, a man of action who thrived in the intensity of the operating room. The idea of stepping into the world of advocacy, of policymaking, was daunting. But at the same time, he felt a spark of excitement, an unfamiliar but powerful sense of purpose. "You want me to help with healthcare reform?" William asked, his voice cautious but intrigued. Dr. Marshall nodded. "I want you to be the face of it. You've already inspired millions with your story. Now let's turn that inspiration into action. We can start small pilot programs, partnerships with hospitals that are willing to break from the status quo. But in time, I believe we can change the system from the ground up." William was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. He thought about Marcus, about the countless patients he had seen over the years, the ones who had fallen through the cracks of the system. He thought about the administrators, the meetings where profit had outweighed patient care, and the frustration he had felt. But he also thought about the difference he had made, the lives he had touched, and the potential for something bigger. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," William admitted. "I'm just a surgeon." Dr. Marshall smiled warmly. "You're exactly the right person, Dr. Carter. The best leaders are the ones who never intended to lead. They simply do what's right, and others follow. That's what you've done. And that's why you're perfect for this." The room fell quiet for a moment as William considered the offer. Could he do this? Could he really step out of the operating room and into a larger fight? It was daunting, yes, but it was also exciting. The idea of creating a system where people like Sandra and Marcus didn't have to live in fear of medical bills, where health care was a right, not a privilege, was powerful. Finally, William nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. "All right, I'll do it." Dr. Marshall's smile widened. "Good. I'll set up a meeting with the board next week. We'll start planning our first steps." As Dr. Marshall stood to leave, he extended his hand once more. "You're making the right decision, Dr. Carter. This is just the beginning." William shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Dr. Marshall. I'm ready." After Dr. Marshall left, William sat in his office, the weight of the decision he had just made sinking in. His life was about to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. But for the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always believed in the power of medicine to heal, but now he saw that the fight extended beyond the walls of the hospital. It was a fight for equality, for fairness, for the right to health and life. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Beth peeked her head in, smiling. "Good news." William smiled back, nodding. "The best." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. William's name continued to appear in headlines, but now it wasn't just about Marcus's surgery. It was about the new initiative he and Dr. Marshall were launching, an ambitious project aimed at revolutionizing the way healthcare was delivered. The media dubbed it the Carter-Marshall Initiative, and it quickly gained momentum. Hospitals across the country expressed interest in participating in the pilot program, and donations began to pour in from philanthropists, corporations, and everyday people who believed in the cause. It wasn't long before William found himself traveling to conferences, speaking on panels, and meeting with lawmakers to advocate for policy changes that would support the initiative's goals. It was exhausting work, but it was also exhilarating. William had never imagined himself in this role, but he found that he thrived in it. Every speech he gave, every meeting he attended, reminded him of why he had become a doctor in the first place: to save lives, to heal, to make a difference. And then, one day, something happened that brought everything full circle. William was sitting in his office, going over the latest details of the initiative, when Beth knocked on the door. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice soft and excited. "There's someone here to see you. You'll want to take this." William looked up, curious, and motioned for her to let the visitor in. When the door opened, Marcus walked in, now fully recovered and beaming with health. Behind him was Sandra, smiling with quiet pride. Marcus was dressed in a crisp button-up shirt, holding a small package in his hands. "Marcus." William stood, his face lighting up. "It's great to see you. How are you feeling?" "Great, Dr. Carter," Marcus replied, his voice full of energy. "I'm all better now. The doctor said I'm doing really well." William smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I'm so glad to hear that. You look fantastic." Marcus grinned, stepping forward and handing William the small package. "I brought you something." William raised an eyebrow, surprised. "For me?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "Open it." William carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a small wooden plaque. On it, in beautifully carved letters, was an inscription: "To Dr. William Carter, for giving me a second chance at life. Thank you." William stared at the plaque, his throat tightening with emotion. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes misting over. This means the world to me, Marcus. Thank you." Marcus smiled brightly. "You gave me a second chance, Dr. Carter. And one day, I'm going to be just like you. I'm going to save people, too." William knelt down to Marcus's level, his heart full. "You're already on your way, Marcus, and I have no doubt you're going to be an incredible doctor." As Marcus and Sandra left the office, William stood there for a moment, holding the plaque in his hands. He thought about the journey that had led him here, the surgery, the media attention, the fight for healthcare reform, and he realized that this was just the beginning. He had found a new mission, one that extended far beyond the walls of the hospital. And with people like Marcus by his side, he knew that they could change the world.